Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's Affordable Housing Roundtable that is presented by the Affordable Housing Committee of the Zoning, Planning, and Land Use section of the North Carolina Bar Association. My name is Aaron Miles, and I am a member of the Zoning, Planning, and Land Use Section Council in the Affordable Housing Committee. I would like to thank Nick Tosco with Pointer Sproul, our Zoning, Planning, and Land Use Section Council President. Um, and the members of the Affordable Housing Committee, Amy Schaefer, Janice Ashley, and Tree Hager Gray, and the North Carolina Bar Association for all the work that went into putting this program together. Today's program features three industry professionals who regularly work and have experience with affordable housing and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Our speakers today are Sherrod Banks with the Banks Law Firm, Scott Farmer, Director of the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, and Mark Shelbourne with Novogradac. Thank you all for being here. For some housekeeping matters, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them at the end of the speaker portion of the presentation. Before we begin, I will have each speaker provide a brief introduction of themselves and their various roles in affordable housing in the affordable housing field. And we'll start with Mark and then go to Sherrod, then Scott.
Very good. Thank you. Happy to be here. I have to start with just some ancient history. I was in planning school with Janice, and then later she went to go work for the Housing Finance Agency and helped me to make the transition to go there to be Scott's lawyer. And not long after I was there, I was on the governing board for the ABA Forum on Affordable Housing Community Development with Sherrod. So I'm happy to get to be with all of them here today. I'm an attorney barely, but really I'm more of a housing policy consultant. I worked at the Housing Finance Agency for 13 years. Also spent about a year at the counterpart in Georgia, and so working in the mostly the housing credit program, but also some of the other appropriated sources. And um, and now I give consulting advice mostly to state agencies around the country, including Hawaii is my new client, which is a lot of fun. And yes, I did get to go there recently. But it's been several others, and I do some work with some local governments, like Raleigh. Yeah, so that's me.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sherrod Banks. I am a principal with the Banks Law Firm. Our firm does a lot of work in this area. We have represented developers, both private, for-profit, private, nonprofit, and public housing authorities operating in this space. We've represented municipalities and lenders, lots of different folks, and we have a new market tax credit practice area also. Um, Been doing this for a long time. I remember Mark wanted to go down memory lane, so I take a trip as well. When I first started going to housing conferences for affordable housing and community development law, you could count the number of lawyers from the state of North Carolina on one hand. The industry certainly has matured and evolved over time. But keeping in mind that the low-income housing tax credit program is fairly new in that it was born in 1986. You can understand how it has grown and matured to the monster that it is now. It is the number one affordable housing creation program in the country. Nothing else even comes close. HUD is not really in the business of creating affordable housing anymore. It's really the LIHTC program and the various subsidies that go along with it that you can find. This is something I really enjoy doing. I think it makes a difference, and we do it throughout the Southeast. So, Sherrod Banks.
And good morning or good afternoon now. I'm Scott Farmer. I'm the executive director with the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency. I've had the privilege of working at the agency now for a little over 25 years. And much of that time, as you heard both Mark and Sherrod mention, has been working with them. And I am not an attorney, do not pretend to be an attorney, and did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. But what I have learned over my career is to surround myself with really good attorneys. And so both of those folks on this panel with me today qualify as that, as well as many of those on this call that I recognize names and folks that I've worked with over the years. But happy to be part of this conversation. Happy to talk about the Housing Credit Program and some of the other work that the Housing Finance Agency does.
Great, thank you so much. To get us started, Mark, would you mind giving us kind of an overview? Because affordable housing is an increasingly hot topic, but it's not fully understood. Can you give us a very high-level overview?
Yes. So as I think about it, the key is to understand that there's housing affordability and affordable housing, the latter being capitalized. And so they're two distinct areas, two distinct considerations. And the way to really get your head around those is to accept two key realities. So for housing affordability, the reality is that the free market will actually serve the vast majority of households. That's just the reality. And so, but it will do so, though, only if it's actually allowed to function. Because you may be thinking, well, if it's not working in my jurisdiction, housing prices are going through the roof. People can't buy anything. The rent is going very high. And you'll hear in many circles, people blame things like Airbnbs or BlackRock buying houses. And those are very convenient villains, scapegoats for why housing affordability is getting worse. But frankly, it's nonsense. The problem is zoning and other types of land use controls like parking minimums, floor area ratios. Those types of restrictions prevent the market from serving the people that it could. And so another way to think about this is when you hear someone say, "Oh, luxury condos don't help with helping the homeless." Well, that is actually scientifically wrong. It's a phenomenon called filtering. And so every time someone wants to build one of those structures and then they get turned down, the folks that are turning it down are actually making problems like displacement and homelessness worse. So that's housing affordability, but that's not what we're really here to talk about, but it's important to have that context. The second, affordable housing, the reality to accept there is that the lowest income households in certainly in our society and pretty much every society around the world, the way the market serves them is substandard structures. And you go back to 1890s before then, when zoning didn't even exist. You can see the examples in places like New York City, the Tenement Museum. That's what how the market serves the lowest income in our society. And we thankfully have a society have decided that's not acceptable. And so therefore the only way to break out of that is to provide subsidies. And so there are various folks like libertarian think tanks who want to pretend that that's not reality, but it is a market failure if you accept that living in a substandard structure is not okay. And so the question then becomes what kind of subsidy? And that's where it starts to get complicated. Everything I've said so far is all pretty basic and obvious, but the question of what kind of subsidy is the best intervention to respond with as capital A, capital H affordable housing to serve the lowest income. That's what we are mostly here to talk about today.
Thank you. Sherrod, you mentioned some of your background working with nonprofits and for-profits. Um, do you have experience with public housing authorities and how they're often the well-known organization that provide affordable housing? And then can you explain your experience and what exactly do those organizations do?
Yes, we have experience with public housing authorities, and in terms of what they do, I mean, as the name would suggest, public housing. They historically have provided public housing and public housing only for a long time, which is to say that the housing units that renters lived in were owned completely by the housing authority. Okay. Um, Today, however, the larger, more successful housing authorities um, certainly have diversified the type of housing that they provide. But first, there was public housing where the housing was owned only by the housing authority, and then came the Section 8 program, and housing authority started providing as a conduit from HUD, from the federal government, housing choice vouchers. These are vouchers that tenants can use to search for housing on their own. They go to a private landlord, The tenant would pay a portion of the rent. The voucher would pay the other portion. That's a housing choice voucher or a Section 8 voucher. Local housing authorities provide those in the jurisdictions in which they serve. When it comes to the LIHTC game, the tax credit game, which is what we're talking about today, one of the most valuable things that housing authorities provide to developers, private developers or the nonprofit developers, is a project-based rental assistance contract, sometimes called a HAP contract. If the developers are serving, and because of Scott's program, they have to serve sort of different income tiers. To the extent they're serving an income tier that has a lower income, then the developer or the owner of that multifamily building needs that tenant to be subsidized. And housing authorities can provide that rental subsidy in the form of a project-based contract or a HAP contract. But to tick off a few other things that housing authorities do very quickly, and in the interest of time, housing authorities issue bonds for the tax-exempt bond program, and they loan the bond proceeds to developers who develop affordable housing. Housing authorities often have land, sometimes very valuable, as in certain metropolitan areas. They also provide loans to developers developing affordable housing. Housing authorities develop or have affiliates, for-profit and nonprofit affiliates that act as developers for LIHTC housing. They enter into partnerships with private developers. They also do case management. So housing authorities are sort of multifaceted in this area, but they certainly started out as public housing authorities, but they're much more than that these days.
Thank you so much for that background. And Scott, we've talked a little bit about this LIHTC program. Will you kind of give us what is that high-level overview of the LIHTC program?
Sure. Well, first, I want to sort of set up, who we are and what we do and how we got involved with the low-income housing tax credit program. The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency is a state agency. We're governed by a separate board of directors. We were created by the General Assembly 50 years ago. We celebrate our 50th anniversary this year. And we primarily started out as an agency doing homeowner mortgages. But over time, we really morphed into a lot of other areas, depending on what funding sources were available, what the General Assembly saw fit to transfer our way, or what was coming out of the federal government. So now we really have 5 core functions that we do. We do home ownership, first-time home buyer programs. We do foreclosure prevention. We do home repair. We do supportive housing, and then rental production. And rental production in the low-income housing tax credit program probably is the one that most folks hear and see the most. But a lot of those other activities are really the core basis of what the agency does. And all of our work is done through partnerships. Folks on this call know many of the folks that we work with. They may be housing authorities or for-profit developers, nonprofit developers. We work with the smallest supportive housing deals are sometimes done with local nonprofit groups that may be focused on domestic violence, or maybe working with homeless populations or serving veterans or persons with disabilities. So we really do all of our work as a state agency is done through those partners. I like to say that housing is very much a local issue. We can't do things in Raleigh, or we can't do things from Washington, D.C. without having those boots on the ground, those folks that are doing the frontline work to provide the housing. And one of the biggest ways we do that is with the low-income housing tax credit program. As Sherrod mentioned, it was a 1986 Tax Act. It was part of the Reagan era Tax Act. It really is now the only affordable housing development funding program that comes out of DC. There's some other funding sources that we receive that support that, but it really is viewed as the primary vehicle for producing and preserving rental housing across the country. In North Carolina, we funded over 130,000 units since the inception of the program. And we average somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 units a year each year that we're able to fund across the state. The way it works, just to sort of keep it at the basics, is the state every state has a housing finance agency or has an agency that receives an allocation of tax credits. It's our job to create a rule book. You've heard folks mention the QAP, or Qualified Allocation Plan. Our job as a staff is we prepare and draft that document each year. that provide the rules and regulations and how you apply for and how you receive those resources. It is very much a limited resource. We get 4 applications for every 1 award that we make each year with the regular 9%, as we like to call it, the regular housing credit program. And then on top of that, we do a lot of work with tax exempt bonds and 4% credits. We'll save that for a different day and for a different topic to get a little deeper into that. But the housing credit program as a whole, part of our role is to create that rule book and create a system where we can serve as many people in as many counties and as many places across our state. You all know that we have a very geographically different state. We also have very different environments between our urban and rural areas and our suburban areas. And the credit works in all of those communities. And part of our challenge is figuring out how to stretch it and make it go further and make it work in all of these communities. We average, as I said, somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 units a year through those various programs. We got this past year, we had 120 applications to start the year, and we were able to fund 35 of those. So those are all good projects, all that have a need in their markets, but the limiting factor is that resource. We just don't have enough tax credits to go around. We have also seen over the years that more and more pressure is being applied to the housing credit program as being the rehab tool. It's being the preservation tool for USDA, for public housing, for our own housing stock. So it's really, that's one of the biggest things that we're facing is how do we do more with less? The costs are going up and all of those other challenges. So that's sort of the high level overview. You all are working in your communities, working with the developers that are approaching you, that are looking to put together applications. As Mark mentioned earlier, I'll mention now that one of the biggest challenges for folks is we're not creating new dirt. So we've got to find ways to stretch this program as best we can.
Thank you so much for that. I will point this question to Mark, but feel free, Scott or Sherrod, to jump in. Mark, why would a developer utilize the LIHTC program for a development project?
Well, some of them ask themselves that question after being in it for a while, and so because as you heard Scott say, they had I think it was 120 applications, of which 30 something got awarded, and so at a public hearing a long time ago, I told them that said developers, you guys are the ultimate optimists, and they came up to me afterwards saying, "Oh, that's so nice." Like, I wasn't complimenting you. I was just simply describing the reality that's what you have to be to go into that buzzsaw of a circumstance. Because every one of those deals had to get site control. So they went to the landowner and said, we need you to not sell this to anyone else from basically December through August or September. And that's not free. And they also had to go to y'all, the local governments, and get zoning. And to varying degrees, that can be really challenging. And so it is a really difficult circumstance to do. And so they're fundamentally two different kinds of developers. There's for-profit and nonprofit. Both of them have to pay the bills. So the fact that one of them is nonprofit doesn't mean they can just lose money willy-nilly. The nonprofits, when it comes down to the brass tacks, they're just as hard-nosed as any of the for-profits. There's no difference there. But there's something of a difference in their motivation. But the way they get paid is if everything comes in on time, on budget, is they'll get a 6-figure developer fee. And that's the main payoff. But to the extent that it's not on time or not on budget, that fee starts to go down. And it can get to a level that one of my former coworkers that's still there with Scott called it a hobby job, where you're basically doing it for nothing. That can end up happening. Obviously, you can't do but so many of those, but they do occur every now and then. And so but if it goes right, again, then you get the big 6-figure developer fee, and they do generate cash flow over time, but it's not anything like a market rate property. That I don't know exactly what an average number would be, but I'd say maybe low 5-figure. Scott would know that better than me. But then the difference though is for a nonprofit, they may have a particular motivation, like to work, and since the three of us are in the Triangle area, there's a nonprofit called CASA, and they are trying to do permanent supportive housing in the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area, and that's their mission is to create that.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and add to that. I think why would developers use this program and be motivated by this program? It's an uphill slog, and every time we have a ribbon cutting event and we're talking about it, we always congratulate the developers because it's a big challenge just competing for this very limited resource. And you would think, well, why do you do this? If there's an easier path, you can do market rate, you can build market rate. But I think what we've found over time, and all of us that have been in this business for a long time, is that even though it's a for-profit entity, they still are a mission-driven organization. You were drawn to this. It's good work. It's rewarding work, and I think that's what we found is that folks that tend to get into this business, it is a business model. It is a niche market. All of us have worked together for a very long time around it, but I think it is because this is the best vehicle and really the only vehicle now. And for folks that are mission driven and want to provide housing for those at those lower income levels, even though it's tough and challenging and you're going to lose 3 out of the 4 deals that you apply for, I think it's that one deal, it provides enough reward. It is, even for the nonprofits, there is that fee at the end of the day. It is profitable when things go well. I think the challenge is that we have had so many things in the last few years that have not gone well. Going back to the pandemic and then coming out of the pandemic and all the cost increases, the interest rate increases, probably the most difficult time. I said that 15 years ago when we had a financial crisis. Can't get any worse than this, but we managed to find different ways to do that. But folks have stuck with it. I think they work in their communities and they recognize in their communities that housing is an important tool and it's important for all of us. And I think that's sometimes lost, is that it's not just about the wins and losses and the profits and losses for these developers, that they are here for the long haul and they've been doing this for a lot of good reasons. But, as we say about folks that work at our agency, all of us came here for a job, but we've stayed here for the mission. And it feels good when at the end of the day that the work you're providing and the housing you're providing is going to those folks in your communities that need it most.
I'll add one thing to that. I think, the LIHTC program is a program that has a well-established market for the equity. Okay. And the LIHTC program, because it was fairly new, it became a place where I wouldn't say inexperienced developers, but developers who didn't have a lot of experience could gain experience in the development game, and also go to an agency like the Housing Finance Agency with a well-crafted plan for doing a development that served a certain population, and then it could access capital markets for the equity for their project without having an awful lot of development experience. And I think that might be different on the private side. And so I think that's the reason why developers have gotten started in the area of the LIHTC program, and some of them stay, even though they do both both affordable and non-affordable multifamily development. I'd also add to that and to the extent that folks don't know this, but a typical 9% tax credit transaction, the equity involved in that transaction is, Scott, you correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere near 50% of the capital stack that's needed to get the project built. And that's a lot of equity for a multifamily project to get the project built. And so the larger, on a percentage basis, the higher the amount of equity, then the lower the debt amount, the debt stack can be. And the lower the debt payments on a monthly basis, the lower the debt payments on a monthly basis, the lower the rents can be, and the project still be feasible. And ultimately, that's what allows the project to serve an affordable class of citizens.
Thank you. That actually leads me into my next area, Sherrod. What does the financing look like, and what does that look like? Who are the players, and then who are these projects affordable to? think you're muted.
Gotcha. To participate in the LIHTC program, the projects have to be affordable to folks at 60% of the area median income. And I really should say that you can have folks at 80% of the area median income, but not a lot. The projects have to be, I guess, balanced such that that they can't exceed 60% of the area median income on balance. But the folks who benefit from the program, the tenants, I think they go as low as maybe 30% of the AMI. I think that's right. Certainly, I've seen 40s and 50 and 60% of the AMI and sometimes 80, but that's who benefits from the program. The financing, you're going to have equity investors. The first project I ever did a long time ago, the equity investor was a dentist running a dental shop in Chapel Hill. Okay. And today the equity investors are major, multinational organizations that had profits in previous years, and now they're looking for tax credits to shelter those profits, and that's who the investors are now. And so that's where the equity comes in the capital stack. The debt can come from construction debt is going to come from usually some of the largest financial institutions, banks that we see in our economy. The permanent debt can also come from them, but it could also come from other large or small sources. But increasingly these days, because of the cost to build these projects, we're seeing debt come from cities and now counties as well. Certainly the state through Scott's program, the Housing Finance Agency. We call this subordinate debt, friendly debt, because it comes in at a low interest rate, which again, the lower the debt payments, the more affordable the units can be. So when municipalities and the state gets involved in providing debt, it helps to keep the project affordable. So I think those are your questions. How are they financed and what are some of the sources?
Yes, yeah, that's great. Mark and Scott, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
I guess the only thing I would add is the other population served pretty much every project since the early 2000s are persons with disabilities. At least 10% of the units in every property is set aside for folks that are referred through local service providers and working with DHHS. So that is also responding to a need that the agency's been doing for a long time.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. Scott, would you mind sharing some of the challenges that you see in this line of work when developments are utilizing the LIHTC program?
Sure, and I touched on that a little bit before, but I think the biggest challenges is just the lack of available resources, funding resources, the housing credits, the subordinate financing that Sherrod spoke to. I think in North Carolina, we're blessed that we are a fast-growing state, but that's also a detriment when it comes to our housing production, period, across the board. We're just not able to keep pace with the need. And what we see across the state is as we have more folks moving in primarily to our urban areas, but also to our suburban areas as well, is that forces the housing prices up and the costs go up for all of us. And then, as I mentioned before, with the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, all of the materials prices, labor prices, everything went up dramatically. National Home Builders reported, basically about a 30 to 40% increase across the board in housing costs, production costs. And when the resources aren't also increasing at that same pace, it puts additional pressure on what we have. In North Carolina, we're very fortunate that our General Assembly has appropriated state dollars through the State Housing Trust Fund and the Workforce Housing Loan Program to provide as gap funding or subordinate funding to help us make these deals work in communities where they otherwise might not be able to. As Sherrod mentioned, the equity provided by the tax credits is the real driver. That's what people are looking for. It can be anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70%. the total development costs are covered by that investor equity. But you still have to balance that out with other resources. And the cost of the housing, the incomes are not keeping pace with that. And the way that those other sources have to be paid for, they're either going to be traditional bank debt, where you've got a bank loan that may cover 10 to 20%, 30% if you're lucky in some markets. But by and large, you're going to have a small bank debt. Then you're going to be looking to the state either for our rental production program loans or our workforce housing loan program loans as subordinate loan. And more often than not now, we're looking to those local governments, the cities and counties, to provide some of that gap filler to make the projects work, just to have them pencil out. It's really the biggest challenge is trying to make these deals work with the resources that are available. We also have the ongoing challenge of the competition for available real estate. The big challenge is, where, as I said before, we're not creating new dirt. So we've got to make use of the sites that we have and the land that we have where it's available. And that varies from community to community. And so when we have an opportunity, we have to take advantage of it quickly to move quickly. And affordable housing and when the government's involved, we don't move as fast as the private market does. So it's finding ways that the local governments can help and push for and advocate for development of affordable housing. If you want it, then you've got to find ways to make that happen. And we've got some really good things happening in North Carolina across the board, where we have local initiatives and efforts that are looking to not only create housing opportunities, but also help preserve some of the housing stock that is there. I think from a development standpoint, it's also the rising cost of operating these properties. I don't think we can forget about the backside of this, whether it's the property taxes or whether it's the insurance cost or just the overall operations. Again, with labor, materials, hiring staff, keeping staff, all of those things figure into the bottom line of how much rent they can charge. One of the big differences and misconceptions about the housing credit program from other things is, that you are making a lot of money from these rents. Well, those rents are really a break-even proposition in many cases, and you're capped as to how much you can charge, which also caps how much you can increase those rents on an annual basis. So if your property taxes or your property insurance, your liability insurance goes up double or triple, you've got to pass that along to those renters. And in many cases, you're talking about a $20, $25 increase. Well, if you're somebody that's down at that 30%, 40%, that's a big increase that they're having to cover. And in many cases, you can't afford to even increase that much if you're at the sort of top of your income or your rent range. So there's any host of other challenges. I think in North Carolina, again, because we are such a popular state, we continue to see new developers and other folks that are interested in the program that come into the state and want to apply for housing credits. And it's one of the strangest things to do. The housing credit program is one of those things that our agency advertises and promotes the least because it is such a competitive program. We have a good network of folks. But when you're looking at, you've got 60 different developers that are applying each year, and you're going to fund maybe 30 to 35 of those. There's a lot of folks that, the business model is not supporting them being able to skip a year or skip 2 years. And we really need to have a strong network of developers, both for-profit and nonprofit partners, for this program to be successful long-term.
Thank you so much. Sherrod or Mark, do you have anything to add before we get to the next question? So we've talked a lot about high level and some of these challenges. Mark, Sherrod, or Scott, would you mind providing some examples of some successful projects or projects that you're currently working on where the LIHTC program has been utilized?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it first. So I live in Durham, and a great partnership emerged between the County of Durham and a for-profit developer out of Charlotte called Laurel Street. The county needed to develop a parking deck because they needed to park more people for their services in this area. And so the county built a parking deck, and they wrapped the parking deck with apartment units. We call it 300 East Main. And inside of that parking deck structure, there's also some retail units along the side and daycare. And it's about to open. I think well, the parking deck's open, but I think the apartments are set to open sometime soon. A very successful project is along Main Street in Durham. And the county is very proud of their first participation in affordable housing. And I cite it because it is the county of Durham's first participation in affordable housing. The city's involved, the state's involved, the county's involved, private developer, for-profit developer. It's a great project, and happy to have been involved in it. Let's see, Janice Ashley's on the call. And she's an attorney in Asheville, and my firm is working there we're representing Volunteers of America. And we're about to close. It's closing season, by the way, for those of us who work in LIHTC deals, okay? We have closings going on here big time. So let me just say it that way. So we're Volunteers of America is going to rehab an existing facility. That was a HUD 202, and they're going to use LIHTC to do it, and they're going to build another facility on the same site, a larger facility. The housing authority in Asheville is issuing tax-exempt bonds. They're loaning the bond proceeds to my client, Volunteers of America. They're using those bond proceeds to rehab and do new construction. Scott's providing the tax credits so we can sell the credits to get the equity, and together, all of us, so many partners, are creating some much needed affordable housing in Asheville, North Carolina. And we all know Asheville needs as much housing as they can get right now. And I'll stop for now.
Well, I'll jump in to only say that, I think of the housing credit properties like I think of my kids. I don't have a favorite. They're all good. They're all important. And I don't want to single anybody out, or I don't want to exclude anybody from the conversation. But I think the examples Sherrod gave are great examples of where this works best is where the communities are coming together with developers to create the housing. And I think for me, that's been the biggest shift I've seen over the last 10 years around the state of North Carolina, is the emphasis by so many cities, towns, counties in emphasizing and understanding the need for housing and specifically for rental housing in their communities. And that's made a huge difference. And I often refer to this as lasagna financing because of all of the layers that are required and all of the parts and all of the pieces of it. It's pretty messy to put together, but the outcome's usually pretty good. And I think that's true of most of our developments. It's not easy work. I would highlight just very quickly as a couple of those examples of where you do draw in these different funding sources is some of the work that's been going on in Charlotte for a number of years, where they were able with their housing trust fund, with a housing bond, but then also leveraging the private dollars that they were able to gather together from corporations and large wealth investors who were willing to participate in that program. And we're starting to see that model materialize elsewhere. It's also those other non-traditional partners that we've seen come to the table. Folks like the Dogwood Health Trust out in the western part of the state. We've been really pleased to have folks like the Golden Leaf Foundation, who has provided funding through our agency for additional housing credit work to help further that mission work. So I think it's really just the opportunities that are there. That if you look around, and what I always tell folks is that if you want to see what housing credits can do, look at the county next door, look in the town next door at the deal that may be popping up there. And more often than not, when I talk to the local government folks, it's always, well, how do we get one of those? And I said, well, developers are going to go the path of least resistance. So if you're welcoming to them, if you are, whether it's providing land incentives, you may have land that you own that you can lease for $1, or it may be that you have other resources you can bring to bear to make the housing more affordable. I think it's imperative that we all are pushing in the same direction to try and provide as much housing as we can to meet the need and the ever growing need.
Yeah, and like children, the properties can just be can misbehave and be disappointing. That does happen. But the really the key to the success of this program, since we're among practitioners, if you're on the Hill, talking to legislators, it's, the propaganda, public-private partnership, all that stuff, which, that's true. But amongst us people that do the real work, the reason why the program has been so successful since '86 is because agencies are able to enforce the rules. The compliance is remarkably effective. And the reason it's effective is because the interests are aligned. As my fellow speakers talked about, you've got multinational corporations as the investors. And so they put in their money in year zero. And if you, as the owner, screw something up in year four, then one of Scott's coworkers is going to find it. They're going to report it to the IRS. And the IRS goes to the mega corporation and says, guess what? You thought you were going to get this much tax benefit that you paid for 5 years ago? You're getting this much. And as you can imagine, they don't just say, oh, well, that's a shame. No, they they go after who's responsible for that. So everyone is interested in that not happening. And as a result, these properties have a tremendous rate of following the rules, which is a big reason why it's a success.
Scott has mentioned land twice, maybe three times, being something that's, scarce, right? I want to mention a project in Charlotte. It's called Trella Uptown. And this is land that the Charlotte Housing Authority, now known as Enlivian, has owned for years and years and years. And it's literally in the shadow of the Bank of America Tower in Uptown Charlotte. Well, what's under construction now is about 350 multifamily units wrapped around a parking deck, all of which are stacked on top of probably 1 or 2 stories of retail that faces on, I think, Tryon Street. That's under construction. And what you have there is a first in North Carolina with a market rate apartment complex coming out of the ground and being financed by a market rate owner, together with an affordable apartment units that are interspersed in together, and they are physically indistinguishable. But we found our way to financing the affordable units with the LIHTC program and the market rate units with conventional equity and debt. And they are completely and totally intertwined and physically indistinguishable in a mixed use, mixed income building. And the partners there are the housing authority that owned the land, the housing authority that led the charge to be the affordable developer, private developers out of Washington, D.C., the county, the city with its trust fund, obviously private equity and private debt to get the construction done. So, and again, of course, Scott's everywhere. If you talk LIHTC, you're talking about Scott.
Thank you so much. I just want to quickly mention for those watching in the chat, we have some very helpful links have been put in about rent incomes and the project that was mentioned by Sherrod at 300 East Main. And then also, if you're looking at projects in your area, Mark also shared that link in the chat as well for those paying attention online. We've talked a lot about the program, and we've talked a lot about property. I would like to kind of pivot just briefly. Sherrod and Scott and Mark, how can the local governments in these areas, you talked a little bit about the financing that goes along with those entities, but how can the local governments assist in this area? And then also, how can counties help on the property taxation side when it comes to these projects?
Well, all of these projects could use property tax relief, okay? Because the property tax bill that comes due every year is one of the larger items that they have to pay. And if they don't have those entities that don't have to pay them, it can mean the difference between a project that's feasible and that does pencil or cash flow, and one that doesn't. Now, I'll say that there's a North Carolina statute that allows for property owned by nonprofit organizations providing affordable housing um, to have an exemption from their property tax. For-profit organizations don't enjoy the same exemption. But then it gets complicated, as everything in the law does, when a nonprofit organization happens to be the general partner, perhaps of a limited partnership, where the limited partners are all large, very large investors. That entity, if it meets certain criteria under some North Carolina case law, can also get a property tax exemption. But they're basically getting it through the relationship they have with the nonprofit. So that's there. What can municipalities do to assist? Anything to lessen the burden of the operating cost. Municipalities know what they charge money for. Things that could lessen the burden for operating costs could be extremely beneficial. Sometimes impact fees aren't payable by the developers of affordable housing. So those kinds of things can be very, very helpful.
I would add to that, anything they can do to speed up the planning and permitting processes. That's probably one of the, because time is money, and nothing is more true than in the housing credit world, where you've got a deadline to meet to place and service the units. And what we're encountering more and more is that folks, especially in the metro areas, are seeing longer and longer periods of times to get those plans approved, permits approved, just so they can begin the work. And that's something I share with all folks when they say, well, what can we do? Well, expedite that process. And I think some local governments are starting to see that and starting to look at ways they can do that, either having not necessarily a fast track, but maybe have somebody on staff dedicated for reviewing and processing those the building plans and permits to help move those things along. Most of these local governments are already investing dollars in there. So if you want the developers to not come back and have to ask for additional gap financing because the project took too long, one of the best things you can do is, again, expedite the processing on the front end and make it. I mean, a lot of folks don't want to say, well, we can't treat them differently than we do other units, but you can't. You already have, because you're providing incentives and you're providing dollars for them. So this is the housing you need. This is the ways that you can do that. So I always encourage folks to look at that too. It's not just a monetary thing. Sometimes it's the processing side of things that can help.
Great, thank you so much. Could each of you provide some key takeaways from your experience in the affordable housing realm, specifically around LIHTC, for those on the call? And we'll start with Mark.
Well, yes, and so I'd kind of thought about this as, instead of takeaways, is more what I would do with a magic wand. And so I'm going to take a speaker's privilege to change your question, if you don't mind. And that is, since we've talked about housing affordability and affordable housing, two different things, the thing that would help the most with housing affordability would be if zoning for residential were just R, no number. So if the jurisdiction thinks it's okay for people to live there, doesn't matter if it's an apartment or a single family building. That's, because people are people. I get that's a radical notion, but I think it's tragic that it is, because again, there's no need to protect homeowners from density. And that would actually, as a segue, would actually help what we're affordable housing, because it would make it easier for developers to find good sites, not have to deal with the NIMBY challenges they have. Every developer who's been doing this work for more than just a few years has at least one. Some of them have multiple horror stories of trying to get zoning approval. And I really can't echo Scott's point enough about that. After the zoning gets approved, after the project moves forward, getting the permits handled in a timely and predictable manner so they know when things are going to happen. That's just, and it also matters for the tenants, because they're trying to move there. And so if you push something back, the opening of it, because you wanted some design review board wants to change the color of a brick, and I wish I was making that up, but that's not hypothetical, then those are tenants that are now having to wait to move, maybe redo their paperwork to be eligible. So all that kind of thing has real downstream effects. And so, but in the affordable housing world, what I had thought my magic wand wish would be for Congress to enact the legislation to expand the housing credit, and that would be great. But higher on the triage now at that level is what the incoming administration and Congress might do with the appropriated sources, home and CDBG. The incoming administration, when they were in office before, had zeroed those out in their initial budgets that they submitted to Congress, and so among other programs. And so obviously Congress didn't take that, but it's not great when you're starting from a point of zero to then go. It's not like you're going to go up to there to a much bigger amount. So I'm hopeful that those programs will at least remain sustained going forward and not take serious cuts.
Okay, Sherrod, looks like you're unmuted. You want to go next, and then Scott?
Well, my big takeaway is that the demand for affordable housing since I've been working in the industry has only increased, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think it will continue to increase, um, and so those of us who care about this industry just have to anticipate that and do some of the things that Mark talked about, lobbying for certain types of resources to deal with the demand. One of the things that we haven't talked about is that is preservation, but the LIHTC program is also used for preservation by way of rehabilitation of existing housing that may have seen its better days, which is just as important, if not more important, than creating new affordable housing to be used in our marketplace and in our communities. And so that just means that more resources are needed. And so we have to figure out a way to deal with that as a society. So that's my big takeaway.
So I'll jump right in there. So I would want the biggest takeaway to be is affordable housing is not something to be afraid of. I think it's something that it should be embraced. It's what we see each and every day. I like to tell folks that over the last 25 years I've been at the agency, I've had tons of phone calls from folks complaining about an application for housing credit property in their community. I've never had any complaints after they get one. The phone calls I get is, how do we get more of this? And I like to use the town of Brevard as an example of that. We had a developer early on when I was at first joining the agency. We had a property that was approved. It was properly zoned, everything, and then the town tried to change the rules on the developer after the fact. And that particular developer sued all the way to the state Supreme Court and won. Brevard now has an affordable housing task force. And they work regularly, and I hear from them every couple of years trying to figure out how they can get more affordable housing into their community. So it is something that we need to recognize. It's all of the stigmas, all of the views that folks have had on it over the years have all been dispelled. They're outdated and useless. I think all you have to do is talk to some of the property managers that work in our properties and have them tell you how many folks come in that are over income, that want to live in these apartments and are disappointed to find out that they do not qualify because they are over income, but they certainly don't feel like they're over income. I think that's what I hope folks take away from this, is that affordable housing is something we should embrace and not be afraid of.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to pivot to Janice Ashley. She has a few questions that she would like to address with the panel.
Yeah, so I'm just going to have the questions that are in the chat. There's only a couple, and Mark has been doing a good job of answering some of them, but here's one that I think is a good one, and I think, Scott, you might want to pay particular attention because I think there might need to be more information on the application process and what are points in the qualified allocation plan. This question from a person says their county is receiving a lot of requests to assist newly formed entities finance new affordable housing development from the ground up, enter into long-term ground lease, How does your organizations or your organizations evaluate risk, vet new private development entities? What evaluation criteria should we use as a county? And do you have any examples of deals that have not gone well with for-profit entities, things we should look out for? You're muted.
You'd think after all this time we'd be used to this and know we need to unmute. But anyway, those are great questions, and some of those are ones that we hear from folks regularly about. What is this? I got this developer that's telling me it's all they need to do is we can lease the land for $1. They'll take care of everything else. Well, we have specific requirements within the QAP because the tax credit program is so competitive. You can't just do this deal. You just can't show up and say, well, I built some market rate apartments in Tennessee, and I really interested in tax credit program, and show up and be able to apply. Not only would you not be successful in applying for tax credits, you're not going to be successful in trying to find investors and lenders. We all have very strict requirements and expectations. And the reason for that is it's an IRS program. It's a very complicated program. It's got long-term requirements, and we want to make sure that the folks that are doing this have experience in doing it. If you don't have experience, the best way to get that experience is to partner with somebody. We, for a very long time in our agency, have had minimum requirements. You had to have been in a deal or done a deal in the last 7 or 8 years, and you had to have been the principal, one of the primary partners in that deal. Is really part of the vetting process. But the other thing that we know is that by requiring letters from lenders and commitments from investors, they're going to do their own vetting process. And if they're not okay with it, these folks aren't going to be able to do deals without somebody else being in the deal. I think as a county, if you're looking at that and you're hearing from those developers, you can certainly reach out to us. If it's what we do is if we get an application or from somebody that may be doing work in another state, we'll call that other state, or we'll call whoever they have been working with to find out, what's their reputation like, what have they been doing. You're certainly welcome to contact us and find out, is it somebody that we've worked with before as an agency? But I think there's resources out there, and we certainly want to be a resource to help you in trying to identify that. You can look at the QAP and those criteria, and you can look at, ask for their financials, ask for their work history, what other projects they've done, so you can see the product at the end of the day. But it's always a challenge when you have new folks that are coming at you telling you what a great deal it is. We all need to be a little skeptical about that.
Just a quick follow-up, Scott. So other points in the QAP, which people don't, Mark mentioned a local government saying it wasn't designed well. I mean, it used to be, I'm not sure, I'm not up on it, but just to know, what does the Housing Finance Agency look at, where besides the site and the design, and just a few points about that?
Yeah, so the scoring criteria is, and this goes back to before Mark and I even started at the agency. The agency looks at these have to be good, solid real estate investments. These are real estate transactions. They're long-term transactions. So we look at the site because it needs to be in good locations, near shopping services, in the areas of growth, not an area of decline. We want this to be good, safe, growing areas that we know will be supported will support this property, and the property will be supported by the community going forward. Not only are those shopping and services necessary for access for the residents, they also are job centers. They're also job creation. It's also economic health. All of those factors figure in there, but you're applying a scoring number to it. We also look at your what other resources you're bringing to bear. We do financial feasibility and underwriting of these projects to make sure that they're financially strong and that they will, they're underwritten. They have to last for 30 years at least. So we're going to make sure that they work. We look at, in some cases, there's points provided for other features, such as right now, the state's been under a settlement on the Olmstead settlement for a number of years. So with the HHS, we have priority counties there for those counties that are a high priority for that population. But really, it needs to be a good real estate transaction first and foremost, and that's sort of what our criteria looks at. It needs to be good design, well built. We have a very thorough design standards as to what the expectations are. We need this to stand up over time, and the partners need to be good, strong partners, and they need to have a good management company in place. Nothing is more important to a tax credit development than good property management, because once it's built, then the maintenance and ongoing compliance are the critical piece to keep those credits in place. Probably missing something that Mark and Sherrod can add in as well.
Yeah, because scoring criteria, again, for those who don't know the program, when we say it's competitive, there's an application process. You have to score a minimum to even be considered. And then it's still so competitive that, I mean, way back when I did it was like, they're all the ones that are winners are all so close in scoring. But Mark or Sherrod, any thoughts? Because it does change over years too. Different priorities in the application have changed over years.
Well, the main thing I tell folks when trying to understand scoring is when you got to read the QAP, but then don't get fooled by looking at something, oh, this category gets 71 points and this category is only 1 point. You might think that the 71 points is the big one that matters the most, and the 1 point's kind of irrelevant. Completely wrong. Everyone gets the 71 points pretty much. Not this last year, not quite, but close. And whereas not everyone can get that 1 point. And so that 1 point matters more because it differentiates. And so that's something that when you're reading the document for the first time, you can't really get a sense of what it's doing unless you also correspondingly look at the list of awards and the scores and how they worked out.
Yeah, the one thing you don't control is your competition. So you don't know what anybody else is putting in their application. And this past cycle was a great example of that, where we had folks that did not bring back sites because they didn't have a perfect score on the site. But had they come back, they would have been funded because other properties fell out, did not come back into the full app competition, or they thought they were missing those points that Mark talked about, but they would have actually picked up points in those categories. So you control your application, but you don't control anybody else that's applying. That's the biggest thing. And Mark's heard me say this before. The QAP is based on comments we receive. It is very much a public document. It is a policy document, but it's framed by the comments we receive. But the biggest challenge for years has been letting developers know, how do you want to lose? And it needs to be a fair process where you understand. And I think that's what we have in North Carolina. But the challenge is, you may be losing by a point or you may be losing by a tiebreaker because these are all good deals. They're all really close. They all have the things that we all want to have with our properties. But at the end of the day, it's when you don't have enough resources, somebody's going to lose, and you have to kind of decide which of those categories are the ones you're comfortable losing by.
Okay. We have a couple other questions, and this is a good one too. The person is asking about, it can be somewhat difficult to determine what and where low-income housing tax credit projects get to the end of their affordability period, which you've mentioned, Scott, is 30 years, but it's actually 15, and then you can opt, I think, for another 15. They say they're noticing this is happening right now. And we have so many that have passed 30 years. How can the community be involved in this process? Presumably about maybe encouraging them to reapply or to extend the affordability.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's in North Carolina, you're required to do the 15 additional. Well, actually, everywhere now you're required to do the 15 additional extended use period. So all the properties have deed restriction in place for 30 years. At the end of that 30 years, yes, those affordability requirements go away. But in many cases, those developments will either have come back in for a second round of tax credits, or they may have other financing that extends beyond that. In the case particularly of USDA financing or the case of the public housing, they often have longer restrictions. And then some of our funding has longer restrictions as well. We've been trying, and we actually, our policy group has put out a couple of different papers around that about the issues facing affordable housing. And we're not really losing the units. We're losing the restrictions on the units, but we're not losing the units. And trying to identify those, we've actually, this year, we rolled out a new program called the Rental Preservation Loan Program that was designed for that reason. It's to try and identify those properties that are less likely to come back in for a second round of tax credits, maybe because they're too small, or they may be in communities where the property itself is in really good shape. They just need to refinance the existing debt that they have. So we're trying some new and different things to keep those projects in the affordable arena longer. The other thing I'll say is some local governments are doing that as well. I know in Wake County, they've rolled out a program that's designed for that, to try and help acquire and preserve existing affordable housing, and also those that don't have deed restrictions. So I think that if you're interested in finding more of those, you can contact our agency. As I mentioned, there's a couple of policy blogs or white papers that are on our website that talk about that. And then there's some other resources that we can point you towards as well to look at those properties in your particular cities and counties that may be reaching that end of the affordability period. The other thing I would say on that too is some of these are going to stay affordable just by the nature of where they are. They're not likely. They're in some of the urban areas, in Raleigh and Charlotte and Durham. We have to be concerned about folks coming in and wanting to buy those properties and then either tear down and replace and go back with higher density, or just buy them, jack up the rents, and now they're no longer affordable. So it's a growing issue as we reach that 30-year stage with more and more properties. But it's something I think we're all aware of and trying to manage as best we can.
Great. Mark or Sherrod, anything to add about how to extend affordability or preserve affordability in these existing projects?
Well, the only thing I could say is that and this is also in response to adding to your response to one of the chat questions, is to the extent that a local government finds that a property is at its year 30 point, maybe it could go to the owner and say, hey, you have a version of the program what Scott was talking about. Use some of your money to help them switch out their HVAC systems to improve it, and in exchange, give them below market debt for that. In exchange, they add another 10, 15, 20 years of affordability on. A lot of these owners would be happy to do that because, like Scott said, it's not like they're necessarily going to jack up the rents a lot, and the tenant turnover is a pain in the neck, and so that could be a cheap way to preserve some of this housing.
One thing I would add is that for the mission-driven land owner, prior to the time the initial development goes up, should transfer the land by way of a long-term ground lease. So if the city owns the land, housing authority owns the land, or a county owns the land, and it's in what I assume it's in a desirable area because we're going to do a LIHTC development there. There's going to be investment there, multi-tiered investment. If you do a long-term ground lease, then after that initial 30-year period, the ground lessor, the city, county, or the housing authority, still being a mission-driven organization, would have some interest in making sure that the ground lessee, which is now the property owner, and they can write it into their ground lease, that the property is going to either be recapitalized and operated as affordable housing going forward, or it goes back to the lessor, again, the municipality, and it can be recapitalized by the municipality acting in concert or in partnership with someone new. So that's what I advise to lots of my housing authority clients who find themselves having land that's really, really desirable in some of the more densely populated areas of our state, where we think that that gentrification is going to drive out all of the affordable housing in certain areas. Do long-term ground leases as opposed to deed transfers, so that the organization can control the land for the long haul.
Great.
Karen,
Those are really great points. I'm sorry, Aaron, there was one more general question, and then I thought Terry Hagler-Gray might have some.
And then I have one question that came directly to me after you do yours, Janice.
Okay. I guess one question is, overall, how do you assess the successfulness of the low-income housing tax credit program?
Well, so to go back to what I was talking about earlier, the home program, CDBG, 811, 202, all those are sweating bullets right now. But the thing is, even in a good year, they still have to go to Congress and get reauthorized and get more resources. So it takes literally an act of Congress for them to continue to get awards. So the way that I recognize the success of the program is, maybe this is too technocratic, but So the state gets an amount per capita. And for 2024, that was $2.90, although it actually is $29 is really the better way to look at it on a per capita basis. And so for 2025, it went up by inflation to $3. And so you think about that for a minute. The state, our state and every other state had this increase from 2.90 to $3. That's a 3 per something percent increase. And probably it took one person with the IRS sitting there looking at inflation, doing some math, and put it out there. So we don't have to worry, not only do we not have to worry about a cut, we're getting a 3% increase by virtue of one employee with the IRS sitting down doing some math. I mean, that's to me, that's almost magical. How else can that happen in government? And so that's the success. And it's going to happen every other year going forward. If inflation's flat, then it stays flat, but then you don't need it as much. And so that's my success measure. But again, maybe that's too technocratic. There are other ways to measure it. Like if you go to a groundbreaking, and I can tell a story that I pretty much even to this day still chokes me up, that about some of the things you hear from tenants. So that's probably a better way to measure the success that you may have actually been asking about.
I measure it by the fact that it's the #1 affordable housing production program in America, and nothing else even comes close to it. It dwarfs every other program. And it's essentially run out of the Internal Revenue Service, which then says to each state, you have to develop a qualified allocation plan, a QAP, for the allocation of those credits. And then those credits are used by for-profit entities that have had success, have profits, and need to shelter those profits. And so then it incentivizes those for-profit entities to partner with an affordable housing developer who could be a private developer, a nonprofit developer, or a public housing developer. To me, that's genius in the creation of the program. And it has proven itself to be genius during the years since 1986. I think it's extremely successful.
Yeah, and I would add to that to say the fact that we are talking about what we have to do with the properties after 30 years because they're still in operation, they're still in existence, and we're worried about keeping them, right? That's the best advertisement for it, is that we want to keep these properties going. I think one of the things I'm most proud of, and that my family is most annoyed by, is that whenever we drive around the state of North Carolina, I can point to a property and know that it may have been built in 1990 or it may have been built in 2020, and it's still there. It still looks good. It's still operating as intended. And there's something that these communities are proud to have there. So I think that the fact that you're not talking about what program needs to replace this, but we're talking about extending it and increasing it, is a good sign that this is, and the fact that everybody else wants to use it. That it's really the thing that all other programs are leaning on to preserve and keep the housing. It kind of speaks for itself, but I might be slightly biased on that as well. But very proud of the results that we've had with it over the last 37 years, and happy that that it is as important to the state and to the country as it is.
So I do have one question that came directly to me. Since the pool of players participating in tax credit deals have expanded, are you seeing deals where large employers like hospitals, school districts, et cetera, are increasingly partnering with affordable housing developers?
That's a great question. And it's one of those areas, yes, they're interested, but where they've taken that next step. We've got individual cases where you've had some local investment from healthcare providers or the education folks. We talk all the time about folks in need of teacher housing. You can't do teacher housing by itself with housing credits, but yet having land that was owned by the school system that now the County Board of Education is releasing so that we can produce housing. Yes, those kind of things are occurring. The healthcare network is one we've been trying to tap into, quite frankly, to have them step in. They are in some cases, but tend to be on a more local level, at a project level, than they are at a statewide level. But yeah, those looking at those partners as well as other economic development partners. I think that's another space for us going forward to focus on is how do we get employers more involved in supporting and providing housing for not only for the employees but the greater community around them in support. So yeah, there's I can't think of any specific examples, but there have been a few examples where we've seen local investments from healthcare providers and education folks as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Looking at the time, I'm gonna go ahead and start wrapping us up and winding us down. Again, thank you so much for Mark, Scott, and Sherrod for participating in the program. This program was recorded and will be provided for reference of the recording. Also in the chat, Lacera has put in some of the previous affordable housing roundtables that were hosted last year. Also, Mark and Amy have put in some very helpful links in the chat for information. And I just want to again thank everyone so much for participating and coming to our program. And thank you so much.